Hi everyone, this is Professor Gulia. So I've gotten a couple of emails over the last few days about how to put together these advocacy papers. So what I actually want to do is give everyone just a couple of quick tips that we can keep in mind as we put these together and as we think about the rough drafts this week and then for next week, the final drafts. So the first thing I want to say as just kind of a general tip that I want everyone to think about is keep in mind that the goal of these advocacy papers is to really have an argument or a thesis statement. So for these papers, the idea is that we are advocating for something, and all that means is that we are pushing for a particular position or perspective. So when I say argument or thesis statement, there are a couple of definitions that I want us to keep in mind. Now, the first is that a thesis statement is a statement with which a reasonable person can disagree. Now, what I mean by that is that if you have an argument, if you have a position that you have to defend, it means that someone can take the other side, and that someone can be a perfectly reasonable, intelligent human being. So if I were to sit here and create an argument along the lines of, I think the United States needs to have stricter gun laws, all right, and I have my whole paper where I bring in particular pieces of evidence, statistics, examples, anything I want to use to support my position. Once I do that, I can think about the other side of the aisle. Someone can come in and talk about the Second Amendment to the Constitution, can talk about the right to protect ourselves, and that person can have a whole series of really reasonable points. Now, for any position, any argument, this can happen, right? If I create an argument about gun control, someone can take the other side. If I create an argument about the death penalty, someone can take the other side. And this happens with any individual topic. Now, another way to define a thesis statement, and hopefully this kind of helps us out, is we can think about a thesis statement as a position based on evidence. So based off of everything you've taken a look at, everything you've studied, everything you've seen, what is your position on that topic? So the goal is to really advocate for something. So based off of your research and everything else, how can we move forward? So if you think that right now social media amongst teenagers is a problem, right? Imagine having written a paper and having found that to be a problem. How would we move forward? What would be the next step? All right, so another thing I want us to keep in mind now that we have this definition of thesis statements and arguments is to keep in mind the characteristics of the strongest arguments. And for me, these really boil down to three main things. So the strongest thesis statements are clear. One of the best things you can do in your papers is to kind of embrace the idea that we should not hide behind language. So you can find a lot of arguments and a lot of writing that is based off of confusing the reader. So a thesis statement that really takes the fanciest, largest words and throws them at a reader, just kind of hoping to confuse them and to just come off as smart. In our papers, our goal is not to sound smart, it's to be smart. So it's actually much harder to have a single, clear, and sophisticated argument, but to get it across in a way that allows the reader to understand it. That's actually far more difficult than to have no argument at all, but to just go through a thesaurus and find the fanciest words and throw them at someone and just kind of hope they give up. All right, so the strongest arguments are clear. They are also direct. So one of the things that is important about having a direct argument is that an argument is always more than a question. All right, and that is because a question isn't a position. So if you imagine reading a paper and the argument is something along the lines, and I'll put this here just to make it easier, should the American government, and I'll use something very similar to the example I threw out before, should the American government create stricter gun laws? I'll stick with that one. So this is a perfectly reasonable question. You can imagine an argument, or sorry, a paper starting off this way. So even though it is a reasonable question, it is not a thesis. Now, what I mean by this is that it's not a position. So a position would be more along the lines of the American government should or should not create stricter gun laws. So either of those positions, and this totally depends on which one you pick, can use evidence to back it up. So try to be direct, try to go beyond the question. You can start there, the trick is not to end there. The third characteristic of a strong thesis statement that I want us to keep in mind is that a strong thesis statement is supportable with evidence. So keep in mind that these papers are actually not that long. The rough draft of the advocacy paper is only about 2 pages long, and the final paper is only about 4 pages long. So try to make your argument specific enough so that you can support it within that time frame. It's actually not that long. So don't feel like you need to cover everything, right? You don't have to cover everything about that topic. Make it specific, make it something that you can support. So don't make your argument about, the history of time, right? So covering all areas and all time. You don't have to be that broad with it. All right, so those are the main characteristics of a strong argument. My second major piece of advice is use evidence. So the strongest papers announce their argument, and then also, and sorry, that was a little typo, they announce their argument, and they also back it up, right? So an argument is a position that is supported by evidence. So in your body paragraphs, try to really work through whatever the evidence is as clearly as you possibly can. Keep in mind that the library is there to help. They have a bunch of different databases, and we have librarians who are more than happy to help you out. So if you are really, really stuck with finding some sources and some piece of evidence that you can use, reach out to me. Certainly, I can help you go through some databases. I'm relatively familiar with them. You can also ask a librarian, and they might have even more ideas about where you can go. Now, in one of my other videos, I'm going to walk through and introduce everyone to a particular database, and it's going to be the Opposing Viewpoints database. And one of the reasons I want to give everyone just a very quick intro to this database is that this is literally a collection of persuasive essays, which are really advocacy papers. All right, so you can go through, you can choose a particular topic, and you can find usually hundreds of advocacy papers on that specific topic. And these are all good sources. The library is nice and the databases are nice because they automatically get rid of all the junk. If you just go on Google and you decide, so if you're writing on the death penalty, and if you go on Google and you just put it in there, you're going to get millions of sources. A lot of different things will come up. However, amongst all of those sources, maybe 10% of them, maybe less, are good, right? That actually have evidence that you can use. So the nice thing about the Opposing Viewpoints database, or any of the library databases, is that they're automatically going to get rid of the junk, so you don't have to spend the time going through all of these different pieces of evidence and sources and picking the best ones. They've already given you good ones, so you can kind of rely on them. You know they're giving you pretty good evidence. Now, just in a general way, a good rule of thumb for these final drafts, and again, these are about 4 pages long, is probably to have about 4 to 5 quotes in there. All right, if you are a little bit more, if you have a little bit more than this, that's fine. Don't make it too much, right? You don't want a 4-page paper with 15 quotes. That is just simply too much to work through. But you also don't want too less. If you have a 4-page paper that maybe has 1 or 2 quotes, you start to get a sense of a reader that the writer doesn't have quite enough evidence to back it up. So shoot for a few quotes in there. All right, so 4 to 5, 6 is fine. 3 is probably okay, but you probably want to be pretty close to that range if you can help it. And then the last thing I want to say is once we have gone through our sources and we have the evidence we want to work with, think about where it should go. So once you have these quotes, I want to give you just some tips about where not to put them. All right, so very quick thing, if you have a quote that you want to work into your paper, make sure you do not have the quote as your thesis. That is simply because the thesis statement is your own original position. When you quote someone, it is in their words, it's their own position. So the thesis statement should be yours, it shouldn't be someone else speaking. Now, the same principle applies elsewhere in the paper. So make sure you do not have a quote as a topic sentence. Now, a topic sentence is the first sentence of a body paragraph. Now, this is one of those sentences that allow you to really control your argument. All right, so because it is about you controlling your argument, you should not, in that topic sentence, hand off the idea to someone else, which is exactly what you do when you start off a body paragraph quoting someone else's idea. You immediately give that person, whoever they are, a lot of control over your argument. So don't have a quote as a topic sentence. And then the last one I'll say is don't have a quote as the last sentence of a body paragraph. Now this is for the exact same reason. The goal in a body paragraph is to really start off in that first sentence or so, directing your own argument. All right, that's the topic sentence. And then at the end of the paragraph, you also want to control the direction of your argument. So you shouldn't be handing off the sentence to someone else. All right, so those are the main 2 pieces of advice. And I'm going to zoom out a little bit just so we kind of see both of them. So the 2 main pieces of advice, just to kind of help everyone out. The first one, again, is to have an argument. So you want a position that you need to defend over the course of about 4 pages for the final draft. And then the second tip, again, is to use evidence. Quotes are your best friend because they give you something that you need to unpack and follow up with your own analysis. All right, so those are the main things I wanted to talk about for this, and I'm going to create another video giving everyone just a very quick introduction to opposing viewpoints. And if anything comes up as you are working on these rough drafts of the advocacy papers and then eventually the final drafts, let me know, and I'd be more than happy to walk you